The Seattle Architecture Foundation is a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting and celebrating the architecture and design of Seattle. The goal of the Seattle Architecture Foundation is to inspire people to appreciate, understand, and engage with architecture and urban design through education, advocacy, and outreach. The foundation offers a variety of guided walking tours, special events and educational programs that explore the city's architectural history, notable buildings, and design trends.
Behind me is the main branch of the Seattle Public Library. This was put up in 2004 after a bond issue was passed to build a new library and enhance regional libraries here in Seattle. It's one of the first buildings in Seattle that made the best use of computer-aided design. And it's such an interesting building. It's a mishmash. Some people call it deconstructivist architecture. Deconstructivism is when you take the elements of a building and pick them apart and throw them on a table and put them together in a way that's different from what had been before. And my understanding of Koolhaas's idea in this building was to put all the public functions in the part of the building that had a view down to Elliott Bay, and the more stable functions where the offices were, the administrative things, more in the core of the building, away from where the public offices are. The webbing on the outside of this building is part of its structure. It's helping to keep the building together, and it is very much, you could take a course in and of itself about the Seattle Public Library. This is actually the third main branch of the Seattle Public Library to be on this site. The earliest one was a Beaux-Arts building that was built in 1906. The second one was an international style building that was put up in 1960. And then we have this one in 2004. And what do we need libraries to be anymore when the physical book isn't as important as it used to be? Libraries seem to be turning into more to public gathering spaces, places for people to use computers that don't have computers, people to gather and meet, have lecture series, that sort of thing. So the whole idea of a library is changing. In Paris in 1925, there was an exposition that was called the Exposition of Industrial and Decorative Arts. And they invited people to display things that were different than what had gone before. They didn't want to see Greek columns or classical architecture. They wanted to see things that were new and modern. And the types of design that came out of that exhibition in clothing, in jewelry, in furniture, and in buildings, years later began to be called Art Deco, after the Decorative Arts Exposition. And the elements of Art Deco design are very simple to remember, and they are, Art Deco, first of all, is very vertical, unlike the Beaux-Arts era where you would look up and there would be ledges and decorative things interrupting your view. And an Art Deco building, from the bottom to the very top, you have these piers that go up in an uninterrupted fashion. So very vertical looking, very streamlined. The second element of Art Deco architecture is setbacks, meaning that the buildings have sort of a stair-step design. And here's a photo of this building from the next block up. And you can see that it's massive at the bottom, and then there are these stair steps going up. And one of the reasons for that, as technology was allowing buildings to get taller and taller, cities were afraid that these massive buildings would reach into the sky and block light to the streets. And so they required that buildings above a certain height had to get smaller. So that was one of the influences on Art Deco design that even actually translated into much shorter buildings as well. So this setbacks was another element of Art Deco design. And the third one is ornamentation. Art Deco design and its ornament are very, very different from what had gone before in the Beaux-Arts. It's very low relief, meaning it's close to the surface of the building, or it's carved into the building itself. And on this particular building, you can see above the entrance here, there's low relief berries and flowers, that sort of thing, cast into this cast concrete surface. If you look above the windows here, we've got very low relief bronze surrounds that have artichokes. And the kind of things that I'm talking about in the decoration of this building, they're sort of agricultural. And there was a reason for that. This building was built in 1929. It was built to house the Northwest Produce, Grain, and Stock Exchanges. Many times Art Deco buildings had decoration that said something about what was going on in the building or something that was going on in the region. And so they were having wheat exchanges here, and fruit exchanges and hop exchanges. And so John Graham Sr. chose to put as his main decoration on this building a lot of agricultural sorts of references. And when you look at photos, here's a photo of a woman wearing a dress in the 1920s. It's very vertical. It doesn't have much in the way of flounces. Her hat is very close to her head. There's not a big cornice on the top. And over here is a reproduction of a Vogue cover from May of 1928. And you can see this very vertical outfit superimposed on Art Deco structures behind her. Behind me is a Dexter Horton building that was built in 1924. It was designed by John Graham Sr., who was a very prominent architect here in Seattle in the first half of the 1900s. And this building became his pride and joy. And after it was finished, he actually moved his offices into this building. John Graham Sr. designed this in a way different from a lot of other buildings that had come before it. You can see this sort of E shape to it. It's got 4 bays that go, the light wells go all the way back to above the archway that's over here on the left, so that all the interior offices have natural light and windows that could open. And in the 1920s, that was a big deal because lighting is not what it is today, and it was more expensive. And being able to open a window and get natural flow of air was really quite a wonderful option. So this again is a Beaux-Arts style. It's faced entirely in terracotta. And those big columns that you see, they're made of a material called granitex to simulate granite. And they actually are a terracotta material that were brought in pieces and then assembled here. In the early 2000s, the city of Seattle passed some new building codes that allowed for taller and skinnier buildings to be constructed. And this building was on the drawing board at the time. And Kevin Daniels had a particular idea that he was trying to convey to his architects what he wanted his new building to look like. And this information comes from the Seattle Daily Journal of Commerce that documented this in that time frame. Mr. Daniels told his architects basically that he wanted a building that made Seattle change the way it thinks about itself. Words to that effect. So that's a very vague brief to give to an architect on how to build a building, what they wanted the building to look like. So in their discussions, Kevin Daniels just kept coming back to the concept and the person of Audrey Hepburn. He liked her sexiness and her sleekness and her angularity. And he said, can you capture the essence of Audrey Hepburn? This one with these angular mega braces that are like a truss that help keep the building up. It's got that sleekness, that sexiness, that angularity of Audrey Hepburn. And so this has silver certification under LEED, and it has that by having solar panels at the top and a water collection system. It has a living wall of plants on the other side of the building. And it also has glazing that reflects heat when it needs to, or absorbs heat when it isn't needed. One of the interesting things about this building is that every floor is a different floor plan, a different footprint, and a different square footage. And these mega braces that I've talked about allow the building to forego corner columns. So at least in Seattle and maybe elsewhere, there was a lack of commercial building through the whole 1920s and through the 1930s and then into the 1940s. And things didn't start to pick up again until after the war in the 1950s. And you can imagine that styles had really changed in that time frame. There's a lot more going on in terms of steel and glass and structure, partially, I imagine, due to the technology advances that were made to support the war effort. The next building to be built in downtown Seattle after the Exchange Building was this building behind me called the Norton Building that went up in 1959. And you can see the huge changes that have happened from the Art Deco era, from the Beaux-Arts era, and the elements of this style, which became known as the International style, featured buildings that were basically boxes that were lifted up off a public plaza on fairly narrow columns that were called pilotis, geometric designs, no decoration whatsoever. And this became the hallmark for skyscrapers around the country and around the world for quite a long period of time. This was one of the first buildings to use what were called a curtain wall. And a curtain wall is a wall that consists of prefabricated window units that are put onto the frame of the building. And so the exterior of the building really plays no role in keeping the building up. So technology has changed so much that the exterior of the building doesn't have to play any role in keeping it up whatsoever. This also used a new technology called pre-stressed concrete beams, which allowed floor space to go uninterrupted by columns for about 70 feet. Whereas the other buildings that came before this, they had columns every 12 or 10 or 12 or 15 feet to keep the building up. It wasn't needed anymore. Technology had changed. And this was the first building in Seattle to put in, from the beginning, an underground parking garage. And the fashion icon in the late 1950s and early 1960s was Jackie Kennedy. And she had these very boxy suits, very plain, very geometric. She almost looks like a little Norton Building here in her gray suit. What I'd like to talk about in this building is what a game changer it was on the Seattle skyline when it was put up in 1969. So this is 10 years after the Norton Building. And this is what it looked like as it was being finished and what the Seattle skyline looked like at the time. And it almost looks like this has to be a photoshopped photo because of the prominence of the Seattle First National Bank building. This building has a nickname here in Seattle, at least to people of my age or older. It's called the box the Space Needle came in. Because if you were to approach the waterfront on a ferry boat and see this and then also see the Space Needle back here, it looked like the Space Needle would fit exactly into the box of this building. International style buildings, when the building is lifted up from the plaza on these very narrow columns, it makes the lobby almost look transparent. And this is a good example of that here. We couldn't see it so much on an earlier building. But sometimes it was difficult to see where the entrance is to go into these buildings because it's all nothing but glass. So around the time of the financial panic in 1893, actually that year, there was a World's Fair held in Chicago that became known as the Columbian Exposition or the White City. And the designers of that exposition built these temporary buildings that were after a school in Paris called the L'École des Beaux-Arts. And they were very different from what had gone before in the Romanesque style and the Victorian style. They were more classical in decoration. They were very highly decorated with heavy cornices, lots of geometric forms, fancy curlicues. And I refer to this as the wedding cake era of architecture because they look like a piping bag has put frosting around the buildings. This is a photo of an 1893 Columbian exposition, and you can see the architecture that was featured here. We have a little Greek temple here. We have an Italian Duomo in the middle of it. Very much classical revival sorts of designs coming out of the L'École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And here in Seattle, we had a 1909 Alaska Yukon Pacific exposition on what is now the University of Washington campus. And you can see that style as well at this World's Fair. It's my belief that there's like an aesthetic of the era. Buildings, and especially women's fashion, seem to have similarities. And during this wedding cake era, we take a look at a photo that was taken of women attending the Alaska Yukon Pacific exposition. You can see that their dresses are very poofy. There's lots of bows and lace, and they have big hats, those that are wearing hats. And so there's certainly nothing understated about the fashion in the early 1900s. And you can say the same for a lot of the architecture on some of these buildings. So we're going to get closer and look at the Alaska building that was put up here in 1904. This was Seattle's first skyscraper. Another thing that causes architectural styles to change is changes in technology. And structural steel is becoming a new thing in this time frame. So let's get a closer look at some of the detail on this Beaux-Arts building. This is made of terracotta, and you can see here there's a chip in it, and it's a different color on the inside than it is on the outside. So it's a glazed material that is glazed to emulate stone. But we have these beautiful interlocking geometric forms. We have flower garlands. Up at the top, there's an angel head with wings and another lion head with a ring in its mouth. Underneath that first ledge, there is a decorative element that looks like eggs with pointy things in between, and those are called egg and dart decoration, which is a very ubiquitous sort of decoration on Beaux-Arts buildings. I have a photo of this building as it was going up, being Seattle's first skyscraper at 14 stories. So this was really a big deal when it went in 1904. This was the original downtown of Seattle, and it started out around Yesler's Mill, which was about a block from where we're standing right now. That was the first industry in Seattle that employed just about every man of every ethnic persuasion. And Henry Yesler and his wife Sarah had a house that they built on the site of the building behind me. And this is a view of 1860 from their little white house that they lived in for close to 30 years. In 1889, there was a fire that started about 4 blocks in that direction, and the wind was blowing in this direction and burned down what really was the city of Seattle at the time, all the white clapboard buildings, some brick-faced buildings. And after that time, the city of Seattle passed some new building codes requiring buildings to be more fire resistant. And so here in Pioneer Square, there are a lot of buildings that were built in the 1889, 1890, 1891 timeframe that have this massive stone and brick in order to be more fire resistant. Romanesque features are the heavy stone at the bottom. That's what's called rusticated stone. It looks like it was chipped out of a mountainside. And what I call those stacks of donuts on either side of the entrance, those are very heavy rusticated stone. The Romanesque features are not only the rusticated stone and the archway around the entrance with 2 or 3 columns called clustered columns, but the arcades of arched windows that go horizontally. But the Victorian aspects of this building are the vertical aspects, the bays that you see that are now painted sort of a blue-gray color. So we're moving clearly into the pure Romanesque revival style. And the features of a Romanesque revival building are this heavy rusticated stone. They tend to be massive as opposed to highlighting decoration. They tend to be monochromatic. They tend to have horizontal arcades of arched windows. So here in Seattle, there was a competition held to design a new headquarters for the bank. And there was a young architect here in town at the time named John Parkinson. He was about 28, 29 years old. And so he designed a building and submitted it for consideration in this competition to win the commission. And in fact, he did. And so this is his building. It was originally called the Seattle Bank Building, and now it's called the Interurban Building after the little Interurban Railroad that moved its headquarters into it some years later. And when you look at a photo of this building and compare it to sort of the inspiration for Romanesque, for Roman architecture, you can see the original Roman architecture here in the Colosseum in Rome, and down below is a photo of this building. And there are so many similarities, it's not hard to see why they call this Romanesque revival. You can tell that this is natural stone and not a terracotta or a manufactured material because it has this flaking here, which only happens in natural stone. And also where it's been gouged, it's the same color underneath as it is on the top. If it were a terracotta material, likely this would be a glaze on it and underneath would be a different color. In 1896, gold was discovered on the Klondike River in the Yukon Territory of Canada. And a ship arrived in Seattle in 1897 carrying those gold bars and prompting gold rush fever here. And so people started swarming to Seattle, and they had to buy a lot of goods to become outfitted to go up to discover gold. The Canadian government required people to come with a year's worth of provisions. And so they came through Seattle and spent a lot of money, and that pumped a lot of money into the Seattle economy. And again, it started to grow. And Seattle began to grow a little bit away from Pioneer Square and established a new financial district up the street behind me. And by that time, architectural styles were changing. And so we're going to talk about how they changed and why they changed. The building behind me is called the Corona Building, and this was designed by architects Bebb and Gould. And this building across the street is probably the best example of Sullivan-esque decoration. This was built in 1903. Here's an example of a Louis Sullivan building from downtown Chicago. This is the Carson Scott Peary department store. So you can see this very organic, almost lacy sorts of designs, and that's what's on this building as well.